I guess each man who loves music and loves life has his own memorable experiences. Those who were fortunate enough to be at Town Hall on the night of February 16th, 1951, I imagine experienced an evening they will never forget. As the artist was on the stage, it was just before intermission. She had finished the first half. The artist was Madame Lehmann, the incomparable Lotte Lehmann, and she spoke to the audience. Our guest this morning, a man who was on the stage with her, whom she referred to just a moment ago, Paul Ulanowsky. Do you remember this this evening, Mr. Ulanowsky?
I don't think I'll ever forget it. Simply listening to the voice now has thrown me completely off balance, as I think anybody would have been. It was the end of 14 years of magnificent concerts with Lotte Lehmann. That implies a relationship that could only be called the ideal relationship with any singer and accompanist that you could imagine. I'd like to attach a personal note to the event that was just mentioned, the farewell recital. The hall was full, naturally, standing room, and there were possibly a handful of people who knew that this would be the farewell recital. Her manager, her agent, and one or two friends. In retrospect, I must be grateful that I was not among them. I had no idea that this was to be her farewell recital. And when Lotte Lehmann said, at the end of the intermission, I'm going to make a speech, she didn't say what it was going to be. And I said, all right, you go out, and when you have finished with the speech, then I'll join you for the rest of the program. She said, oh no, I want you to sit out there. So when we both went out and she started her speech, I had to brace myself for what I could only guess was coming. There was not a tearless eye in the whole audience, except Lotte Lehmann. With incredible discipline, she carried through the speech and the rest of the program. And it was only after she had said, I will try to sing an die Musik. That may have been the psychological cue for her, that there was an attempt to do something which would include so much personal emotion for her. In singing this, you might almost call it theme song for the last time in Town Hall, that prompted her to abandon this discipline, this control, just a few seconds before the end of her singing, when she broke down. I'd like to say that this was not a studied thing. She didn't expect it to happen. And as she went from the piano out the door of Town Hall, she said to me, this is terrible. An artist with that much experience should have the discipline not to let this happen. So this was entirely impromptu. I think that you ought to know that.
Of course, this is overwhelmingly moving, Mr. Ulanowsky. You mentioned the word emotion, the artist and emotion, earlier before we went on the air. I was asking you the number of great artists whom you've accompanied and been practically the alter ego of them on the stage. And I asked you whether you yourself, the impeccable accompanist, does not become emotionally involved sometimes.
Certainly. First of all, there is the literature that you perform. Since the accompanist has to take into account not only what happens in the piano part, but also in the vocal part, he familiarizes himself with the emotions and thoughts that are expressed in the vocal part. And in order to do full justice to the work of art as an entirety, he must associate, not to say identify himself, very closely with what goes on in the text. And that means that your emotions should get involved up to a point with that, in the ideal case, actually to the same degree as the emotions of the singer. Naturally, you always want to have your mind retain the last control. Without that, you would get carried away beyond the point where good taste allows you to perform. But without the emotions, I don't think that anybody could perform to his own or to the public's content. I've never tried to, and I hope I never will.
The intelligence must be in control, but at the same time, that free rein must be given within that framework.
Within these limitations, yes, there must be emotion.
Not a cold intelligence.
No, although I have come across people where the cold intelligence and the artistic organization entirely on instrumental, vocal, and stylistic lines was paramount, almost to the point of obliteration of genuine direct emotion. That is possible.
That is possible. Now, this is a fascinating point that you raise. Does this move an audience? The artist, let us say, is cold, let us say, but a master craftsman. Is the artist's craftsmanship so good that she moves the audience?
Certainly. I don't think that the audience, theoretically speaking, has any idea whether the artist himself is moved and to what point, because he transmits matters of emotion by certain tricks of the trade, by everything that is in his tool chest of transmission. Now, in order to handle these tools properly, he has to retain the mental and intellectual control. Furthermore, it is his duty rather to evoke certain reactions, aesthetic as well as emotional reactions in his audience. Now, when we are deeply moved in a concert, we are moved by impressions that are made on our emotional centers, whether they were made from emotional sources of the performer or whether they were produced by his artistic, skillful manipulation of these tricks of the trade, is beyond the listener to decide. Actually, I think it is the artist who has a very fine control of these skills, who can gauge the intensity and the timing of these impressions more carefully than somebody who, in singing or otherwise performing, wipes up the floor with his own emotions.
The artist need not cry to make the audience cry, if I may just use a phrase.
Exactly,
Yes.
he shouldn't.
He should not. I'm smiling as you're saying this. I remember I was some years ago, I watched this actor in a play, a very moving play, was Watch on the Rhine. And I was so overwhelmed, I saw it 4 times, I cried every time, and I asked a friend of mine who was in the cast and understood this man must be terribly moved. He said, oh no, he's so cold.
Exactly.
And thus it was,
Yes.
He was a fine artist, fine actor, and thus it applies to the singer.
Oh yes, definitely.
There's something you had said, Ernst Heffliger, the very excellent tenor, whom you accompanied Friday night at the Studebaker Theater, said something about you as he was rehearsing. He said you were advising him in some of the pieces, the compositions were so great in themselves, he did not have to impose too much. Would you mind expanding on that a bit? Too much of his own. His artistry is there, but the piece itself was...
Well, I think that, first of all, I'd like to correct it. I'm not advising, that would be presumptuous. But when it comes to the close collaboration on leader, then you feel you have to unburden your own conscience and you want to reach the greatest possible agreement between the two performers. Every piece of music, of vocal music or any other field, has its own gravitational field where the emotions and other aesthetic elements are defined and limited. it is our interest first to establish the limits of this field and then try to reach the utmost in expression and delivery within these limits. When somebody has more to give than this field suggests, then there is always the temptation to give more than the score demands. You want to lavish all that you have on your audience or on this particular piece of music, and every now and then it so happens that a piece is not elastic enough to carry all this extra weight of expression or whatever it happens to be. And then I feel that I should tell the singer that from my listener's point of view, this might be too much of a good thing. And a singer who is both the instrument and the performer on this instrument sometimes doesn't have that kind of distance to gauge the effect that he creates with his singing. And therefore I feel it's up to the accompanist to raise his voice every now and then when he sees it.
You spoke of the accompanist as a collaborator, ex-collaborator. The point you made here, the piece, the nature of the work, whether it's a Schubert lied or a Mozart aria,
Yes.
the nature of the work will determine how much the artist, the performing artist, has to give to it.
Right.
Some more than others, some less. That is, there's more. If the artist is good enough, he has more he can retain. There's more where that came from.
Naturally, yes, and that makes itself manifest no matter what he sings. Actually, I think in the withholding of vocal splendor and in the greatest economy of execution is the great mastery that we admire in the great accomplished singers.
Something else I had mentioned to you after the interview with Mr. Hefliger. I spoke to you while he was out of his good humor, his ease. There's something you said that, of course, because his confidence, he knows his craft. There is no need for a superimposition of heavy.
Yes, I mean, when you know who you are and what you can do, it gives you an authority that asserts itself quietly. You don't have to stress anything.
The ponderousness superimposed doesn't have to be there if the talent is there.
That's right.
Mr. Ulanowsky, you've been described as the consummate accompanist, the art of accompanying. I know nothing about piano, but we think of you and the various artists, the singers whom you've accompanied. The art of the accompanist. Would you mind, I know this is a general question, your own coming to it.
You mean how I became
Perhaps
an
how
accompanist?
you became an accompanist, and from this we will.
That was an unusual combination of very favorable circumstances. I was born as the son of two singers, and so got my training as soon as I could distinguish the black from the white keys practically at home. When I had to play for my parents, my father was a voice teacher, so I started very early playing for his pupils. And from there on, it was an easy way down or up, as you wanted to put it, into the job and the profession of an accompanist, which I enjoyed then and still enjoy.
So it was accompanying your father first, then?
That's right.
Where was this, Mr. Ulanowsky?
That was in Vienna, where I was born, raised, got all my musical education. It also might be of interest that when Mr. Hefliger mentioned that this Song of the Earth, in which he performed the tenor part, was Bruno Walter's last recording of this work, I, in a more modest capacity, was active in the first recording that Bruno Walter made of the work, because a very early recording was made during a concert of the Philharmonic Orchestra in Vienna, where Walter performed Mahler, as he so often did, and where I played the celesta part. For many years I had been an incidental piano and celesta and harpsichord, even piano player in the orchestra. It was my privilege to play under all the big conductors. And when Mr. Hefliger sang the tenor part, I was reminded of these many years ago when I played in the same work.
In a way, the completion of a cycle.
Exactly.
A Walter cycle.
That was my reaction, a very personal one, I admit.
It seems, again, you use the word a personal reaction. The person and the artist on the stage cannot be separated. They're parts of the same being.
I think so. Of course, there are certain aspects of the person that come more into the spotlight on the stage, but I don't think you can easily separate the two.
Were there, in your Viennese boyhood, were there major influences among piano players in your memory?
I must admit that this is so long ago that I can only remember very few and rather disconnected facts about it. Of course, everybody who played any instrument or who sang came to Vienna just as they come to New York or Chicago to perform. And as a student, I listened to as many concerts as I could get in to hear. But I could not say that any particular man exerted that much influence because I was interested in too many different aspects. I was playing piano, I also studied the violin and viola, and I took theory lessons and played chamber music, so that practically anything in the whole realm of music was of vital interest to me.
All interested you. But it was the piano primarily. You said you studied the viola, the violin, chamber music.
That was for the fun of it, in order to get a better aspect, more rounded idea of what music was, even for the performer. But piano naturally was my main instrument and eventually my bread and butter.
Well, the phrase to describe you, accompanist, the master accompanist, as distinguished, say, from a solo pianist.
Well, these are two completely
Yes,
different things, and they are distinguished not only by the fact that there's entirely different literature. In comparison, I should say that the accompanist has so much less to worry about. There are so many fewer notes to practice, and that was one of the great attractions to me in the profession of an accompanist, because it left the 8 or 10 hours that the solo pianist has to practice every day for other purposes, which I valued very much. Then, of course, it's a matter of temperament, because if there is something in your personal build-up that cries out for asserting yourself and having no other gods beside you, then of course you are the born soloist. But in the other case, if you enjoy working together in a team, ensemble of 2 or 4 or more people, then of course the possibility of doing accompanying or chamber music work is a much closer one.
And isn't there thinking about you, Mr. Ulanowsky, isn't there the added challenge to an accompanist, though he may play less than a soloist, the challenge of that other being, that, I don't want to use the word adjustment, because adjustment isn't right either, the sensing of the nuances and all. You've accompanied so many of our finest vocalists. This challenge of...
Oh yes, always to expect the unexpected, no matter how well rehearsed something may be. Also the challenge of performing one and the same piece with different artists from completely different angles, and in a greater majority of cases, even in a completely new way with the same artist on different occasions, so that there is actually no repetition, even in as limited a repertory as the vocal literature may be in comparison with the vast solo repertory.
The different experience in accompanying the same artist in the same number. For example, let us assume Lotte Lehmann. Again, if we may come back to Madame Lehmann. You've accompanied her some 50 times in
New York alone, yes.
And let us say An die Musik, for example, any number of times. And yet each time there was another nuance. It was never quite the same, was it?
It could never be quite the same. You have to realize that, of course, as you repeat the performance of one and the same thing, the large outlines will be the same. They will fall into a predictable pattern. It is the very small details, the taking of a breath, the taking of a bigger breath here, the accentuation of this part of the sentence rather than the next, heightening of the inflection in another. These assume a major importance because they are the distinguishing marks between the last week's performance or last year's performance. It is not that they are intrinsically of great value, they only serve to illustrate to yourself that there is no dead, no empty repetition of anything if somebody goes at it with the freshness and the spontaneity of a new experience.
So no matter how planned a recital might be, there is always that element of some improvisation.
Oh, there should be, definitely. The ideal is that you prepare something extremely well, carefully, sometimes over weeks or months, and then in a moment of performance, after they have sort of settled in a groove, you make yourself forget those and create, as it were, completely from scratch. You don't do it, fortunately, because all these things that you have elaborated in the rehearsals of weeks and months before have become routine in the better sense of the word.
Isn't this a marvelous paradox? The more you prepare, the more seriously two artists, the singer and the accompanist, prepare, the better chance there is for freshness, in a true sense.
Yes,
that is, you're free of all the...
That's right. If the preparation is always a creative one, if it is not just repetition for repetition's sake, then I would say that this holds true.
Mr. Ulanowsky, I'm not asking for anecdotes because it's really minor, but you have accompanied so many different artists, I imagine so many different temperaments too.
Oh, yes.
And yet you find each time your approach as an accompanist it's new. You start afresh, as though you start afresh again.
For me it is easier in a way because I react to whatever I find the emotional or intellectual atmosphere to be set by the singer. After all, he has the much more difficult job to perform, and it is only right that I sort of find the same level of approach, emotional, intellectual, stylistic, aesthetic, and what have you. And once this is established, we can discuss possible changes where it might be of value. But for a lot of obvious reasons, it is easier for me to adapt myself and the way I play the accompaniments to the requirements of the singer's preference than the other way around. Although in the last analysis, when people get together for a longer period of work, it always develops into a system of give and take, of exchange of information, of comparing notes, that finally there doesn't seem to be any coercion. That only happens when there are extraordinary circumstances influencing the performance, or when a singer feels that he is not in complete control of all his ordinary vocal gifts, and that a certain extra care is required of the accompanist to be on the alert and do things a little differently from the accepted way. In that case, I might tell you a story.
Please do. I was hoping you would.
Which, however, concerns people that are long dead. The famous Polish pianist Ignaz Friedman, in his early days, was traveling as an accompanist to a singer, a tenor, who was well past his prime, and toward the end of the tour, it happened one night when the tenor was even more tired than usual, that in the middle of an aria he dropped about 1.5 or 2 tones in the middle of a phrase, without dropping more than a beat. Friedman transposed into the new key, and at the end of the concert, the singer was overjoyed at having such a fine and alert accompanist, and presented Friedman with an extra florin, which at that time was a fortune for young Friedman. I'd like to say that Friedman told this story on himself, that for the end of that tour, he always managed to start the one or the other piece of the program in a key which he knew would prove too high for the tenor, so that during that course, the tenor would have to drop, Friedman would drop with him, and cash the extra florin at the end of the concert.
Picked up a lot of florins that way.
Yes.
It's a marvelous technique.
Yeah. So there are, let us say, unusual experiences as well as sources of income for the accompanist.
There is something else inherent in the story, though the story doesn't deal with the element of accident, of happy accident. Sometimes something can be accidental, and yet the accompanist or the vocalist can use that accident, make it become an asset.
Oh yes, that of course depends entirely on the sang-froid, on the stage presence of the performer. These things do happen, fortunately they do, because they enrich the life of both performer and the audience, and as long as the performer knows how to make the accident rather a funny experience than a disaster, everybody gains by that. I remember once there was a long, beautiful program presented in Town Hall by the distinguished mezzo-soprano Martha Lipton. It was a very long program because she was intent on showing any number of facets of her art. And despite that fact, there were still people, lots of people left who wanted encores. There was one encore and another encore. And then we came out when they still were clapping for the third encore. And people were sort of sitting down, the doors were being closed. It was quiet, and I raised my hands to play the introduction when from the back of the hall a child's voice piped out very clearly, "Aren't we going home yet?" That was the wonderful thing to happen at the end of the concert. The house broke down. It took a long time before that last encore, which was fortunately a short and happy one, could be performed, and then that was over.
Martha Lipton, in a way, then welcomed this.
Oh, yes,
picture.
yes.
It
I
made-
don't think that she had engaged a child to come in.
A private clap,
Yes.
anti-clap.
Yeah.
There's a point that Madame Lehmann raised during one of her interviews here in Chicago on this station when she was teaching at Northwestern. And I'd like your opinion of this, Mr. Ulanowsky. You've accompanied so many of the excellent singers. She was decrying the speed, the rush with which so many singers are brought to the fore these days. She spoke of more intense training, and as a result the singer grows more naturally. Do you feel this so today?
I'm aware of that, and I also am aware of the fact that the singers and the students cannot be blamed for an economic system that has exerted its force and its influence on the music life just as it has done in any other direction. We live in an accelerated speed of experience everywhere, and it is very regrettable that in the field of art, where a slower development should be maintained, this cannot be done, at least not as much as it used to be done when I was a student. These are things that are very difficult to assess. Somebody with a very fast capacity for absorption, assimilation, and reflection will suffer less from that, but other people whose way of developing is slow will be very much at the mercy of good luck and connections before they find their own fulfillment, or rather come sufficiently close to the fulfillment of their potential.
And yet the person with the facility who, let us say, is able to span this obstacle, overcome this obstacle, isn't that a sad thing too? Perhaps too much facility and not enough of the time to call upon his innermost resources? You know, there's the great facility, and yet you feel there's more there perhaps if we're slower.
Certainly there would be, but then there is always the possibility, and let us say the hope, that these things will catch up with the performer, even though he may not have been able to assemble all these paraphernalia during his course of study. They will creep into his performance as he matures as a person. And I don't think that, it sounds a little corny, that anybody who is or wants to be a real artist ever stops learning. I find myself reviewing the same score that I have looked at 30 and 35 years ago, and I find new or different things in it. It is not because necessarily I have neglected to study this, but when you grow older, you look at things in a different way, so that you keep learning and adding new experiences, even if infinitesimal ones, to the store of what you know about any one piece.
You then do go back, you reread, you look over, relook.
Well, that is the singers that make me do that, because they always like to go back to the masterpieces of the 19th century. That is the great treasure chest of vocal literature. There's naturally music from before and after, but the vast bulk of the vocal literature in which I'm involved stems from the 19th century. And there is no end of going back to that.
And in that going back, as you say, you are different now than you were some 20 years ago. You're a different man. And
Yes.
so you look at that very same work, but there's a different pair of eyes involved now.
Yes, the only thing is I don't know it. I only assume it.
You assume it.
Yes.
Yet. Perhaps one last question, well, there are many questions I'd like to ask you, Mr. Ulanowsky. You're very gracious. An assessment on your part of concert goers today. We speak of the speed which we live in today, technological advances, the rush. Is there a difference? Do they listen more or less? Do you sense this on the stage than, say, 20 years? This is a tough question. I know your own assessment of audiences today, say, contrasted with 20
That
years
is very hard for me
Yes.
to say, because I could not really judge from their reaction how they listen. Because when they applaud, they may applaud a variety of things, some of which may not even have to do with their listening at all. The difference between, let us say, American and European audiences, to me, is something that, to my mind, has nothing to do with music at all. In Europe, by and large, the concerts start at 7 or 7:30. People go there having had a little snack, and they have supper afterwards. And I feel that listening to music or partaking in any artistic experience, even as on the receiving end, is quite different when your stomach isn't full with a large dinner. And there, I believe, American audiences are at a disadvantage.
You feel then listening on an empty stomach or a light snack might make them more conducive to another kind of food.
Yes, you are more alert, and there's no doubt about it that your reactions, both the active and the negative, are much faster, and you are more in tune with what comes from the stage than when you are busy watching your own digestion, so to speak.
Mr. Ulanowsky, these comments you're making are very, well, I don't want to use the word profound, they're very, very perceptive comments. Certainly, they're both. They have very perceptive comments. I know there are many questions I'd like to ask you. I'm also thinking of your rest for the various concerts you have to perform. Anything you would care to say that you haven't said thus far? It could be anything in nature, your own feelings about music today, the art of the accompanist, or taste generally in reference to music today. Comments that you haven't said thus far that you feel like saying.
I think I'd like to come back to something that we discussed at the very beginning. The field of music is so diversified today, so much more than it was 100 or 200 years ago. There are so many more styles to be taken into account, so many more different ways to present music. We have the radio, the television, and so on. So that whatever I could say would have to be hedged in by considerations. This applies to this, but not to that, etc. I think the most important thing is the honesty with which you try to identify yourself with the composer, or when it comes to vocal literature, with composer and poet. To go back to what they wanted to put down in their combined work of sound and word, to go to the ends of your imagination in recreating the atmosphere out of which they have written this particular song, and then transmit it in terms of your own perception as well as in terms of your own artistry and vocal or instrumental gifts. Still, however, trying to be their spokesman rather than consider whatever you do as a playground for your particular personal endowment. If you do that, and if you keep that foremost in your work, I think the rest will take care of itself. It's just a matter of schooling and application.
We come back to the core of the apple then, the artist, his honesty and his respect for the work that he is performing, no matter what the age in which he lives.
Yes, nothing that eventually will always tell.
Perhaps the best way to end this, to me, very delightful and pleasurable conversation, Mr. Ulanowsky, is in hearing the voice of Lotte Lehmann once again, the last song she sang during her farewell concert, An die Musik, which I imagine is almost a trademark.
Well, that's the credo of every artist, certainly of every musician.
The joy that is in music, the
Yes.
love for music, and it's
The credo and the thanksgiving.
the thanksgiving. Thank you very much, Paul Ulanowsky.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Mr. Terkel.